Hello everyone and welcome back to Whisky Wednesday. You join me today for something a little bit unusual. I have a really good, or I think it's a really good, personal story attached to this whiskey. And I'm actually going to have to use my phone for most of this because the history of this product is, it's not unfathomable, that's probably that's hyperbole for sure, but it is something which is, it's still to this day classed as a foundation product for American whiskey and rye whiskey in particular. And that is this thing. Old Overholt Straight Rye Whisky. A couple of things to clear up. Here in the UK, this is not readily available. I found this on the Whisky Exchange for about 45 British pounds, which is a lot more than what it costs in America. It is a 75 centilitre bottle that is bottled at 40% ABV. I believe as of 2020, most of this stuff in America is 43% ABV, or 86 proof, and is also non-chill filtered. There is also a 100 proof version, which I cannot find anywhere. But yeah, this is something which I just saw and thought, that's pretty fun. This looks like it belongs in an Old West bar. And by all means, that story will become a little bit relevant later on. I have it poured in this glass. I'm just going to cover it because it is still amazingly summertime in the UK. It's a beautiful, like 22-degree day. But let me read you a little bit of history. So, Old Overholt began its foundations in West Overton in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania rye is a very particular style of rye, and back in the day the rye content of it would have been significantly higher than what it is now, but you'll find that with most ryes, including like Rittenhouse probably being the main one, but Pikesville rye is probably still the only sort of classic, well-known example of Pennsylvania rye. It's relatively high. The brand is now currently owned by Beam Suntory, and the liquid now is made by Jim Beam Distillery. It doesn't exactly give me a readout on the percentages in the mash bill, but most rye whiskies that are now made in Kentucky distilleries, most of the time are between 51 to 53% rye, so just hitting that minimum to slightly above. Called like modern rye, I suppose you could call it. But here we go. So the brand itself was founded by Henry Oberholzer, which was anglicised to Overholt. He was a German Mennonite farmer and moved to Pennsylvania on the banks of Jacobs Creek in western Pennsylvania in 1800. His family came from the area of Germany which specialised in corn or rye whiskey. Rye grows particularly strong in Germany. I imagine corn probably does as well, but here it's corn spelt with a K, so it's a little bit more unusual. A little bit of a brief idea about the history. By the 1820s, the distillery was making 12 to 15 gallons of rye whiskey a day. The company grew massively. It was being advertised in newspapers by 1843, and by 1859, the Overholt Company had become incorporated to A. Overholt & Co. Then we get into some kind of dullish numbers. Prohibition, big thing. The national prohibition of alcohol, or the Volstead Act, hit in 1920 and pretty much destroyed a lot of American brewery and distillation. Perhaps because of its association with the Secretary of the Treasurer, who at the time was Warren G. Harding, Old Overholt secured a permit to sell medicinal whiskey, which is still something you could do during Prohibition. The permit allowed Overholt to sell existing whiskey stocks for druggists and medical use. In 1925, under pressure from temperance movement people and prohibitionists, a gentleman called Mellon, M-E-L-L-O-N, sold his shares of the company to a New York grocer, thus ending its local ownership. The company was sold again in 1932 to the National Distillers Products Co., which owned more than 200 brands at the time. World War II, massive decline in whiskey. We have a very old example of a bottled in bond pictured there, just to show you guys that. I won't make any beats about the bush with this. This is Wikipedia, but that's what an old bottle, or maybe a current bottle of the 100 proof looks like, with the red sort of motifs on it, which we can't get here, which is kind of a shame. Since December 2015, Old Overholt and Old Grandad, both of which are Beam Suntory brands, have been marketed together as the Olds, which is quite cool. And then we move into like popular culture stuff, and this is where this whiskey really starts to sit in for me. Old Overholt is closely associated with the Old West. That label fits in perfectly behind a bar in your favourite Western film, Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, it just works. Particularly in Tombstone, Arizona, and is served in Old West tourist saloons in Tombstone to this day. The brand was parodied in a Warner Brothers cartoon, various issues of Mad Magazine, and the Terry Pratchett novel The Dark Side of the Sun and soul music as Old Overcoat. So there's a cool reference for you Pratchett fans. And the Old Overholt Distillery was a plot element at the end of Season 3 of Boardwalk Empire. The distillery was part of a deal struck between Andrew Mellon, the gentleman we chatted about before, and Nookie Thompson, who was played by Steve Buscemi in Boardwalk Empire. None of you have watched that, it's totally worth a watch, it's great. It was cancelled very early. He persuaded Mellon to let him manage it to implicate spoilers, so I won't do that. And then we have famous drinkers of the stuff. Ulysses F. Grant, John F. Kennedy, John Foster Dulles. He and his brother, particularly intense individuals. Bar means if you Google the Dulles brothers, D-U-L-L-E-S, their history and their impact on modern history as we know it now is pretty much untouchable. Not particularly great men, but I suppose technically anyone involved in politics isn't and can't be really. But that is a brief history of Old Overholt. But what is my connection to it? I always forget when I did this. I'm pretty sure it was for my 26th birthday, which would have been in 2018. I decided to treat myself to a solo trip to New York. Funded it all, bought the tickets on New Year's Eve, got the visa, all that stuff. And in my last day in New York, I was staying in Brooklyn, and I went to this place. I'm sure it was called like Mama's Barbecue or something. It was just somewhere in Brooklyn. I can't remember it to this day. They made the best little fresh cornbread things I'd ever had. The barbecue food was incredible. And the staff were really good. And I was kind of gearing up to leave relatively early the next day. It's about 10 p.m. And I was like, I've eaten food, cool. And I just sat down the bar, got chatting to one of the servers. And I was like, what is this? Just saw this on the back bar. And she went, oh, that's Old Overholt. How do you not know? You call yourself a whiskey guy. How do you not know what this brand is? And I was like, whoa, okay, let's go. Let's teach me, talk to me, dive me into the history. She gave me a very brief overview of what I've just read to you. And then she poured me a dram of it. Now, I asked for a double. And a lot of you watch this program are Americans. If you ask for a double in America, especially if you're getting on quite well with the person who's serving you, it is so much more than a double. I think I've safely poured probably just either exactly or just over 25 mils into that glass, which is a single. She served me in a tumbler, and it was brimmed to about here. And I was like, well, I'm definitely going to get to know it now. And this indeed was the last American whiskey I tried on my first solo trip to the States. And when it came up on the Whiskey Exchange, I just had to buy it because it's that nice connection. But it's got great history, it's got a nice personal history. But what does it taste? And what does it smell like? Now, it is young stock. It's only 4 years old. So it's not going to be the most barrel-driven style of whiskey you'll ever come across. And indeed it isn't. After having reviewed the Ben Romack that we've published last week, you can really tell on the glass that this thing is significantly younger. But it leads to one of my favourite ever smelling notes that I've ever had on a rye. And for some reason, this thing just smells like grapefruit. I don't know if it's the combination of that slightly kind of soury rye new make spirit and a little bit of virgin oak influence. But all I get on this thing is like gentle rye spices of like cinnamon and mace and Christmassy things. But there's this huge hit of grapefruit. I bought this quite a long time ago. I actually can't remember if I bought this year in 2024 or maybe the tail end last year. But there isn't a lot left in it. It's like a very dark bottle. Yeah, it's about, I'd say we've got just under half a bottle left there. Yeah, I just can't get past it. There's also some peanutty notes to it, which isn't normally something you'd find with rye. That's more of a bourbon thing. But most bourbons contain rye, and most ryes contain corn. So you're always going to get some crossover notes. And they are distilled in the same way. Yeah, peanuts and grapefruit, Christmas spices. A little bit of what could be construed as sherry, but just like a raisiny, sort of marinated fruit note to it. You You do get the youth from the taste. It does kick up a little bit of slightly sharp, slightly sour flavour profiles. I can't really think of anything to say that isn't the word grapefruit. But you do get that running through. But it's something that I really like. I've famously said on this channel before that I'm a fan of spirit-driven styles. I do like old whiskey, but I like old whiskey when it's not the equivalent of chewing on a piece of stave. I don't find that particularly interesting. I find it kills a lot of flavour off. But when I'm drinking whiskies between like 3 and a bit years old to 10, 11, 12, depending on the cask variety, I do like to taste a little bit of that new mixed spirit. And with this, again, it just comes across as that huge grapefruit style of flavour. The finish is relatively short. It's not the longest thing you'll ever experience, but it again just has this gentle, toasty, warming sort of feel to it. When it comes to scoring this thing, I'm not going to lean too heavy into my nostalgia because it's not that available in this country. It is very much in the United States for probably a ludicrously cheap amount of money. But at £45 in the UK, you can get better rye whiskey. That's like undeniable. But leaning a little bit on my bias, I do quite like this. It's double the cost of a bottle of Jameson's in the UK, essentially. You do get a little bit more in the bottle. Oh, dog's having a little scratch session over there. But, you know, I'd score it on like a similar level. I'd give it like a 7. It's a whiskey that I pour and I don't have to think about. It's got a great amount of nostalgia attached to it, which for me within whiskey is a very important thing, as I'm sure it is for a lot of you too. But yeah, I'm going to give Old Overholt Straight Rye Whiskey a 7. I hope you enjoyed the brief history lesson. That was all just from Wikipedia, but like noted in my notes section. Sort of like compressed, as it were. So if you want to have a little read about the brand, feel free to. They do have a little website at the bottom of this label, which I think is just theoldswhiskey.com, if it'll focus. So by all means visit that. I've had a bottle of Old Grandad before, weirdly enough picked that up in Vancouver Island in Canada. So I've tried both of the olds now, which is a nice completion for me. But yeah, it's a 7 out of 10. It's a nice, easy drinking product. It's a little bit expensive over here, but it's something that stateside, which is where most of you who watch this are from, you can get quite easily. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.